In a world where people think and say what they see and hear, welcome to the Daily Lie of Omission. I'd like to pick up where we left off in our last report on the anatomy of revolution, defined as a governmental bankruptcy, and all revolutions share certain historic structures, and so is the case today in our age of revolution. While revolutions in Europe follow a plot line well, in America there are always exceptions to the rule. Our current revolution involves an initial battle between two competing entities within our ruling deep state, which leaves we Americans out in the cold. Forget about draining the swamp. Right now it's a battle over which reptiles are going to rule the swamp. American Judeo-Christian or dynamic global reptiles. It involves stories, so this will be a three-part report. The first broadcast will examine the anatomy of the second stage of revolution and its uniquely American exceptions because unlike other revolutions that adhere to a specific chain of events. As I mentioned earlier, the United States has its own quirks and forecasting is more of an art. In part two, we'll examine the war on Trump and identify those Soroses that are working to bring him down in his only way out. Part three of this examination, I'll review who the future major players are going to be and the likely outcomes, including what we should expect from the players, their tactics, and the strategies necessary to win the revolution. And what is critical to understanding during the second stage are referred to as the replacement government, or RG. It never survives, and its failure leads into the revolution's third and most violent stage, which people identify with a revolution, but by then it's too late and events slide into the unthinkable. And if the conditions are even right, advances into an expanding civil war. Problem is, these conditions are a sharply divided nation in both wealth and society, and a population trained in the art of war. And in America, the conditions are not only right, they are ripe. Now, the revolution continues. The second stage began on January 20th, 2017 with the inauguration of Trump, whose administration becomes a replacement government that will fail. The government is generally moderate to right, while its opposition comes from the right, then center, and ends up on the left because everyone has their own idea for a new government, but it's the committed extremists of the left who historically prevail. With a huge problem, part of the problem for the new government is that it is weighted down by the same systemic failure that brought it to power. Faced with the task of making government work, this replacement government, one, is usually unaccustomed to political power. It's the Trump administration. And two, its first mistake is to assume that they can make the old system work. This mistake, number three, is compounded by the belief that they can do so by bringing in the right people. This is a guarantee of failure because the inherited government and institution is in reality an ad hoc government which, one, the new people don't know where their bodies are buried, while two, the holdovers make their job difficult, exactly as we've seen in the Trump administration, which the RG, that's the replacement government, never quite figures out until it's over, but by then, it's too late. Separating the new RG from previous administrations is one, that the honeymoon experience of a replacement government is very, very short, exactly as we find in Trump's honeymoon with the lamestream media, the DNC, and even his own party that ended on November 9th, 2016. Two, the press is historically easy to pay off and plays a large part in repeated attacks against the RG in a Goebbels-Bernays-type propaganda assault, which is used to precondition masses and evolves into the illusion of truth for lies around which a small group of dedicated extremists take advantage of. And despite the RG's increased prestige and power, it is conversely just as restricted by its laws and the structural failure of its institutions. It puts it in virtually a no-win situation. That's exactly what we're going to see here with the Trump administration. It really doesn't matter if it was Bernie or Trump. Who won the election? That fate was already sealed before the voters abandoned the systematically failed government of 28 years of Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama. It's just a progression. Because the opposition, unburdened and restricted, tears at the government from both within and without, from left and from right, like a wolf pack. In the end, the modus operandi of the most successful revolutionary groups are those comprised of a small, dedicated group of extremists fast on their feet, led by a heart of steel, willing to commit to extreme violence when the chips are down. And for the replacement government, it's a situation where even the guiding hand of Lincoln or Washington would be overwhelmed given the speed with which failures compound from all points and they inevitably begin to overtake the administration. Literally to survive, one almost needs the combined sociopathic instincts of a Machiavelli, a Napoleon, and a Metternich rolled into one. It's either that or the RG, that's replacement government again, has to change the entire system of government. It's the only way out. And as mechanically simple as that is to do in today's America, the courage and will to overturn the daily operating models of entire branches of government is lacking, not only in the replacement government, but in those factions which opposed the RG, as both continue to focus upon the symptoms of failure in the status quo of the old government. It's really quite mad and defines the insanity that comes with a revolution where people continue to make the same mistakes, expecting a different result. While all governments that fail in revolution share the burden and bankruptcy of overreaching war debt, there's one historic point that is never mentioned, and that component I find in every revolution is a newer and unestablished legislature. We find that in every revolution, from England in the 1640s, America in 1776, France in 1789, Europe spring in 1848, 1917 in Russia, and Russia again in the late 1980s and 90s, because the public forum is where all differences are resolved. And if it's not a strong and established institution, its failure plays a big part, if not even larger, than the failure of the RG in precluding is a prelude to ushering the violence of the third stage of revolution. And just for academic clarity, I don't count China in the many so-called revolutions in Africa and the third world nations after World War II within this complex, as they're all either the result of post-colonization as induced by the CIA or their Soviet counterpart, the KGB, and involve an entirely different classification and genus of political appeal. So with that disclaimer, let's go on. The exception to this legislative fault is in America in 1860, but here the contributing elements to the Civil War were migrants, and as I'll explain, even here events dissolved the Congress. Accordingly, while today's Congress is well established, I believe it is going to be the key to our current revolution. Otherwise, America exhibits each check-off precondition necessary to a revolution: bankrupt government, suffocating war debt, massive disparity of wealth, deeply divided society, a duality of government, all of which overlays an underlying economic discontent. And most of this is self-explanatory, except duality of government, which plays a major role because as the opposition refines itself, the number of factions gets smaller. At the same time, these surviving factions simultaneously integrate themselves into a segment of an alternative government. In the case of the United States, this would either be the states or our increasingly publicized shadow government, our deep state, coalesced around the CIA, Pentagon, military-industrial complex, and Wall Street, the NSA being a division of the CIA by its original authorization created by Harry Truman, an act he regretted in the 1960s. All this seems to be coalescing under James Comey of the FBI. This guy's on both sides of the fence. It's amazing. He's got one half on one half on the other, and he's put himself. It's almost like J. Edgar Hoover. He's got something on everyone, but he's become the key pivot man, and I think it's getting away from him. It's getting too big. Not surprisingly, we find California talk about secession. So there's the duality, the alternate government in the states, and then we have notables like Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, John Paul Roberts, former aide to Reagan, David Stockman, former congressman and aide to Reagan, Glenn Greenwald of Ed Snowden fame, all calling out the deep state by name for trying to overthrow Trump. Once debunked as a conspiracy theory, Julian Assange's Vault 7 WikiLeaks report has laid bare a shadow government within the CIA. The point here is the duality of government we find in a revolution, and eventually the faction or factions that survive begin to inherit or command one part or another of the duality of government, which then begins to squeeze the replacement government from power. It's exactly what we're seeing. Once we accept the reality of a shadow government with the powers beyond the reach of government and its control over wiretaps and spying on Americans without their consent, nor the fairy tale that the secret FISA courts are supposed to provide, it's a no-holds-barred kind of game, and things like blackmail and the threat of scheduled suicides becomes very real. The opposition also brings with it an eradication of the predominant religion, as we see in England's Presbyterian opposition to Charles' Catholic popery, which in turn was opposed by the successful Puritan Roundheads of Cromwell. We see it again in France against the Orthodox Church. In Russia, the atheist Bolsheviks to the Orthodox Church, and again in Russia in 1980-90, where the atheists were ousted in favor of the Orthodox Church. The only exception, again, 1776 America. But as we consider our 1860 Civil War, there was in the North a strong anti-popery, anti-Catholicism. Another feature of the second stage is the measured decline in voter participation that declines as the revolution progresses. This is something else that we should look for. Part of it is a declining interest in one faction or another as they are eliminated during a winnowing process of competing factions. But in reality, the declining vote is more often chalked up to threats, intimidation, and outright attacks by the surviving factions as voters stay at home out of self-preservation. Now, we will see a decline in the midterm elections and into the presidential elections. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the United States. And again, this is going to revolve around the Congress. And again, that is what, with the American Revolution, the one we're experiencing right now, is the one we really need to focus on. If it works and continues to operate, we have a good chance of avoiding going into the third stage of revolution. If it starts to fail, because we establish a third party or an outside group and can't form a majority party, a ruling party, majority in the House and the Senate, or if Congress fails to be able to even do its job that it really can't do and hasn't done for years, that could be a problem. That's what we want to keep our eye on. So what is unique in America today is the loss of older voters. There's something that, as they pass away, except in places like Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia and other large cities, where longtime conservative voters that have died start voting Democratic. Of equal significance, however, is that as the aged voters are being replaced, are passing away, they're being replaced more and more by millennials. This will become an accelerating trend and is going to impact the Congress. You kind of follow what I'm saying. Yeah, I can't help but recall a discussion I had with leading members of the Republican Central Committee in DuPage County, Illinois, that dominated local politics. It was thoroughly Republican. In the 1980s, I provided them with a printout from the Voters Register's office depicting the changing demographics of a baby boom generation that was increasingly registered as an independent and even Democratic. I suggested they devote more of their budget to reaching out to boomers, but I was told I was wrong. They did not spend a penny on attracting the boomers. Whereas in 1980, every elected post in DuPage County is held by a Republican. Today, DuPage County is represented almost increasingly half and half by Democrats and Republicans. And in 2016, DuPage County voted for Hillary Clinton. This is unthinkable 30 years ago. And if you told people this would happen 30 years ago, as I did, they would have told me I was wrong and I was out of my mind. But I was right then and they were wrong, and I see the same pattern today as both conservative and liberal political money is directed to the status quo, but the new millennial progressive alt-left is repeating what the boomers did 30 and 40 years ago. And we'll talk about that in part 3, but keep that in mind. In reviewing the revolutions before our own, I find the European spring of 1848 and mid-1800s closest to our situation today globally. There was a famine in Ireland, and America was at war in Mexico as the demands of the Industrial Revolution ran headlong into ancient status monarchs who were unwilling to bend and answered the European Spring, the revolution, with killings, mass arrest, and deportation of a violent counter revolution that was very successful, at least from the monarchs of Europe, from their view. Now, this created the great migration from Europe to America from 1850 to 1858, exporting the votes and manpower that sharpened the differences between North and South, lighting a fuse that only existed because necessary manpower required to staff our Civil War was created by our invasion of Mexico in 1846. But it was this immigrant boost to growth in America's economy and voter base that created the bubble and crash of 1858 that drove King Cotton and the northern states even further apart because King Cotton bailed out the North and the North resented it. And these revolutionary migrants from Europe then helped to elect Lincoln. They won the early war in Missouri by filling the manpower breach that enabled a civil war in America, which otherwise probably never would have occurred. But, such are the unintended consequences of migration, famine, war, and revolution. As I mentioned before, even in 1860 and 61, our Congress pretty much dissolved. And here again, you have that problem. It's the Congress. That's really our focal point. Today, however, America's endless neocon wars have pushed the migrants into Europe. So that's different. Now Europe's getting what we had, while America still retains a well-trained and armed civilian militia. All these guys have come back. You talk to them all. None of them knows why they were there. You put them in a situation where they have to use their talents. They have them. Much like the Civil War in America in 1861. In fact, if it were not for the deep divisions between not only the have and has-not in America, a product of the financialization policies of the private Federal Reserve Bank, but the social divisions created by the artificial personal politics of social justice promoted by our divisive government and the media, I expect America would be along the edge of the woods instead of hovering over the abyss. But given our established legislative institution in Congress, America is much better off, but that can always change. What I find most worrisome is the increasing confrontations between Trump rallies and the anti-fascist movement using fascist tactics, pretty much financed by George Soros. And as we get into the war on Trump, we'll show a lot of that going on and where it comes from and how the whole thing works. And I find this extremely worrisome because once violence starts, that is a genie that is not so easy to put back into a bottle. And just an example in Syria. In 2011, a protest began after a 14-year-old boy was arrested for painting graffiti against President Assad. Within 3 months, 1,000 civilians, 150 police and National Guard were dead. Fast forward that to 2016, 600,000 people have died in Syria, and millions from Africa and the Middle East have migrated to Europe, and that's where the flame's going. Europe. It's the unintended consequence of war, famine, and revolution. Even in 1861, right after Fort Sumter, few in America could imagine the bloodbath of our Civil War could even be possible. But from 1861 to 1865, upwards of 750,000 young men died out of, I think it was 25 million Americans at the time. And trillions of dollars in today's dollars went up in smoke. Well, I think we've made our point, but we're running low on time, so we'll pick up the second stage of revolution in our next report where we'll examine the war on Trump, because I want to get to our Monsanto moment. Today's Monsanto, my Satan moment, is reported in a lawsuit against the U.S. EPA in collusion with Monsanto to lie about their cancer-causing glyphosate herbicide, commonly known as Roundup. Apparently, a federal judge had given a green light to depose former U.S. EPA scoundrel Jess Rowland, who was in charge of the U.S. EPA's glyphosate investigation. This gave way to the discovery of emails outlining the smoking gun in the hands of Monsanto and Jess Rowland's conniving games with science accusations by EPA scientist Marion Copley. It's shown in these email passages where Rowland writes to Dan Jenkins, U.S. agency lead of regulatory affairs for Monsanto, "If I can kill this, I should get a medal," in reference to stopping the investigation against Monsanto's cancer-causing herbicide Roundup. Whereas Rowland is obviously looking for a high-paying job with Monsanto when he leaves the CPA, which he did within days of the leak of his official CARC, that's U.S. EPA Cancer Assessment Review Committee, which Rowland chaired. This just goes to show you how easy it is for a sociopath to climb to the top of any regulatory agency, sell it to people in government for a big payday. Sociopaths are drawn to power. That's why Washington said you can't divide the two. This is a standard operating procedure in every government when the powers of Congress are given to any agency. They will always end up in the hands of, in Washington's words, cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men. That's a sociopath. And this is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So Washington described the sociopath, but they didn't have this term for sociopaths in those days. But that's what happens when you have a government with all these centralized powers. I would remind all viewers again that this spring will begin the wholesale poisoning of American farmland, our fresh water and food supply with Monsanto's Duo, the 21st century's answer to Agent Orange, which mixes glyphosate with 2,4-D, which according to Stephanie Seneff of MIT, promises to make every other newborn boy, one out of two newborn boys in America with autism by 2025, a mere 9 years away, all because of Duo. How do you like those apples, America? Can you imagine America where every other male is destined to become a ward of the state? Not in Russia or China, because they don't allow Monsanto's poisons to soak their farmland. They don't even let GMO grains into their country. So open wide, America. It's poison time. Yum, yum. Time for a revolution. We don't live in a world turned upside down. We live in a world that's been turned inside out. Finally, under the headings of all is not what it seems, I can proudly announce that I have been banned from Zero Hedge's comment page for questioning one of its articles, which they quickly pulled after my pointed comments, proving as even the most stalwart appearing news organization can, have, and will be compromised. So be on your toes, America. I wear this banning as a badge of honor. You can subscribe to these videos of the Daily Life of Mission by clicking on the blue box when you type in William W. Faywell or WMW Faywell into your YouTube. You can read all about liberty legislation at scienceofliberty.us. And you can read this script at electanewcongress.com on the blog page. You can always buy the book if The Science of Liberty, American Reformation, on my website at scienceofliberty.us. You can make donations. It all helps. Thanks for listening, America. I'm your host, William W. Faywell. Surf's up, America.